John, on that fascinating moment, come on in. I mean, what's really interesting and great to get from you is a sense also of the role of the private sector here, because that's really your métier, the business human rights dimension, and self-sanctioning by firms has been a big element of the story.
Big element, yes. Sanctions bleeding into boycotts, I guess. I mean, first of all, to associate myself, I think is the term we're using, with the Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, as a human rights organisation, we stand with Ukraine, we stand with civil society in Ukraine, with human rights defenders in Ukraine, and I just want to say that unambiguously, that there's an act of, a complete breakdown, I would say, in the norms of the society and the world in which we want to live. But we are talking about economic warfare. Let's be clear. The Deputy Prime Minister said Russia uses its leverage like a weapon. We're having a discussion about how the West should use its leverage like a weapon. And the difference between economic warfare and the warfare on the ground, where you have the Geneva Conventions, developed in this country, 150, 200 years ago, is there are no rules when it comes to economic warfare, as we're hearing. I mean, there are a sense of Groundhog Day. And I remember Iran, I remember Sudan, I even remember the McBride Principles for Northern Ireland. I'm that old. And there's an element of us trying to find those rules and those benchmarks each time something comes along. And it's very important we do learn from the past, and I'm going to try and take the long view here. You asked me, Adam, to think about it from the perspective of business. Well, I think for business should see this in three buckets, perhaps, and the buckets are not watertight, but they're associated with each other. The first is in Ukraine itself. It makes a big difference as to whether you're in free Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, or in areas of conflict. You have the Geneva Conventions, which I've mentioned, humanitarian law, and other things to consider if you're in Ukraine itself. The second bucket is individual sanctions, and acknowledging Magnitsky and everything that's developed over the past few years. A lot of work has gone in to create a sanctions regime around individuals that is clearly stated in human rights terms. That's very, very important. And so we should build on that, even in the context of the urgency of the moment. And then the third bucket is this broad-based sanctions around particular business sectors. And what I'm seeing also on some boards in some companies is withdrawal even above the requirements of sanctions. Companies are moving before they're being asked to move. Now, the third thing really then to say is we need to gather the evidence, and it's very important that and acknowledge the work around war crimes research that the government is doing at the moment, and the first trial that's already underway in Ukraine now, that we get the facts, we document the abuses, the genocide, the international criminal violations that have taken place in the country. We need to create an evidence base for what are economic measures. But we're having, over recent weeks in the Congress and all around the world, particularly in the West, big discussions now around what it means to target individuals versus whole populations. Who are the real violators? Who are the innocent? Are there any innocent in the context of Russia? Gross violations versus serious violations. And essential goods and services, medicines and food, should they be exempt from sanction regimes? Now, the short term, I think, is clearer. The long-term consequences of where we're going are less clear. A lot of this is trade distorting. Are we actually talking, if we think about all of these measures and everything that's happening, about the end of global free trade in the way we've discussed over the past 30 years at Davos and elsewhere? These broad-based sanctions, when do they become boycotts? When do we elaborate these rules of the road that boards and companies can use to decide when there's a fact-based approach to withdrawing from the Russian market? So I'll just end by saying three things, and I think, Eric, you said some of these things already. Be precise, the first thing. Be really precise. State the objectives, whether you're a government or a business, as to why you're disengaging from the Russian market. Cite your rationale within international law, human rights, corruption. Be very clear about why you're doing it. The second is to measure and evaluate. Beware of unintended consequences. And Eric, you've mentioned the diminishment of leverage over time in the context of Iran, possibly. How do we know in the medium to long term that the path we're walking down is actually having the purpose we intended? Magnitsky, again, allows us to measure the consequences in the terms of specific individuals. Broad-based sanctions, you're measuring the impact on a whole population. Beware of unintended consequences. And third, for boards, for corporate boards, and today we launched a report for boards in terms of their impacts on affected stakeholders. Whatever your decision, make sure that you put at the center the impact on the human being. So if you're withdrawing from the Russian market, make sure you're doing so responsibly. Responsible exit and responsible entry are key factors here in the discussion. Cutting and running, leaving staff and others in harm's way is no way to behave. So responsibility comes whatever your decision. Thank you.